Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about Stockholm Syndrome, specifically its history, its rough definition as a syndrome, and what it's sort of morphed into in modern times through more modern understanding. So, what is Stockholm Syndrome and how did it get its name? Well, Stockholm Syndrome gets its name from a 1973 bank robbery incident that happened in, you guessed it, Stockholm, Sweden. The robbery took place over 6 days, wherein it devolved into a multi day standoff with the police, obviously not an ideal situation. Now, during this time, many of the captive bank employees ended up becoming sympathetic toward the bank robbers. This was not something that people had really witnessed firsthand before, but we'll get into how accurate of an assessment that is. Now, once the captives were set free, some actually refused to testify against the bank robbers in court, which again was very off putting and very upsetting to law enforcement because they weren't used to this. Now, I will say I'm not going to go into details about the incident itself. However, there is a PowerPoint that I found online which goes into the incident and kind of breaks it down, especially in relation to Stockholm Syndrome. That'll be linked in the description along with my other sources. So if that's something you want to look into more, highly recommend going down there. Now, in this particular incident, like I said, some of the captives were a little more tender towards the bank robbers, but some of them even went so far as to allegedly raise money for the robbers' defense. Now, in order to better explain this strange type of phenomenon, a criminologist and psychiatrist investigating the event actually ended up developing the term Stockholm Syndrome. We'll get into a little bit about the creation of this term later on, but that's kind of the bare bones of really how it originated. Now, based on their supposed analysis of the incident, they actually used this new terminology to describe the affinity some of the bank employees showed toward the bank robbers. Now, the history of Stockholm Syndrome itself stems from this one particular incident, um, which highlights something modern psychology actually calls appeasement. And what Stockholm Syndrome postulates is that captives or victims develop legitimate and honest positive feelings towards their captor or their abuser, when in reality, these feelings aren't as genuine as the public tends to perceive. Um, in reality, most captives choose to at least try and appease the perpetrator, and this is done as a way to help attain survival. If they can sympathize or help emotionally regulate the captor by using positive behavior towards this captor, they can increase their likelihood of survival, which is probably what most people want. Now, in simple terms, it's a basic mammal response, something that science has observed in multiple species. For an example, a puppy will engage in play with an older dog. This is something I've witnessed myself with different family dogs. I'm sure you guys have probably seen it as well, where when the puppy engages with the older dog, the puppy will appease the older dog by rolling over on its back if the older dog pins it down or if the behavior of the puppy is being corrected. And the puppy will expose its belly and engage in what we determine to be fawning based behavior. Now, while happens with puppies, humans aren't entirely different. We're obviously not completely rolling over and exposing our stomachs, but the sentiment is still the same, which is likely what the investigators observed during the bank robbery. Now, one thing that's important to remember when it comes to the term of Stockholm Syndrome is that it applies to many different situations, which is actually why it ends up becoming as problematic as it does, because it's not very consistent. For instance, Stockholm Syndrome, according to many, many articles that I skimmed and read, can apply to domestic violence issues, sex abuse issues, sex trafficking issues, kidnappings, divorces, really almost anything if you can articulate it well enough. So it's really hard to nail down any specific criteria, which again makes it difficult. Additionally, the development of what people used to consider Stockholm Syndrome depends on a slew of circumstances, such as the length of captivity, the extent of the relationship, the length of time that somebody can have to develop a relationship, what the perceived danger or threat is, the number of perpetrators, the number of victims besides the one person that may develop Stockholm Syndrome. Is everybody in this situation developing Stockholm Syndrome, or is it just one person? So it gets very, very complex. We also need to consider the fact that historically humans have been abducted, kidnapped, and forced into very dire situations, whether that's through war, Western expansion, slavery, you name it. Historically, it wasn't uncommon for captives to try and befriend or sympathize or even change their belief systems depending on their captors because it made them more likely to not only have a better chance at survival, but they may even receive better treatment. For example, let's just say we're like back in the days of Genghis Khan. And given his brutality, the speed at which he expanded his empire, and how much the population was impacted by him, would you really want to risk pissing him off? Or would you accommodate to him the best of your ability to help ensure your survival, whether that means adapting culturally or behaviorally? Whatever it is that you needed to do, I can guarantee that most people would rather do that than, get strung up on horses and ripped apart. Now, from an outside perspective, you would look absolutely crazy, like you fell in love with this guy and you adore him, which is most likely not a proper reflection of how you actually feel. Another thing we have to consider, think about all of the women forced to marry politicians, princes, and kings back in the day. Did they really want to risk being executed by their awful husbands? I'm looking at you, Henry VIII. Or would they rather tolerate the abuse by placating the man's ego and just trying to help him be emotionally regulated in whatever means necessary? And when we think about things logically, we can see why Stockholm Syndrome isn't necessarily what we interpret it as a society to be. It's really been around for centuries, which means it's not the new and strange phenomenon that those investigators were alleging. This also means that Stockholm Syndrome itself isn't real, and it's more than likely just a behavioral development that was passed down by our ancestors for survival purposes. There's also less extreme versions of what people are deeming Stockholm Syndrome. For instance, I'm sure ladies can agree, but at some point in our life, we've all had to appease a man to de escalate a situation and prevent harm from coming to us or one of our friends or a family member. It is unfortunately a very common experience and something that, even at a very young age, we somehow innately do, even without realizing it at time. For further historical context, I also want to talk about some concepts that were brought up in a thesis, which I'll link below. And the thesis quotes, hostage taking is found in ancient Greek and Roman mythologies and the Norse sagas. At certain times in history, it was even more common than it is today. Medieval rulers regularly hired assassins to murder or hold for ransom political enemies. We also have to examine criminal enterprises like the cartel, which also uses hostages and random demands, other religious extremist groups. Stockholm Syndrome, when we look at it from a critical lens, can be seen absolutely everywhere. And it's basically existed since the dawn of time. Now, part of the reason the public perceives Stockholm Syndrome as being a mental health disorder with deep-seated positive relationships between captor and victim is because at a surface level, they don't understand how deeply some people are willing to go to try and survive. And that's also because most people don't end up in a hostage situation or a kidnap situation or a sex trafficking situation, whatever it may be. Now, in some instances, what really baffles people is that hostages won't always cooperate with, for instance, law enforcement. Sometimes they basically give law enforcement the middle finger and say, well, I'm not going to help you help me get away from the perpetrator. And this is because they feel that they can't really risk turning against the perpetrator. Something that people don't tend to consider is that the person holding them hostage or the person who has the individual kidnapped has complete and total control over the situation. That is why in law enforcement, you are taught and trained that the hostage taker, they're at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to how you prioritize people's safety and how you prioritize people's life. Because at the end of the day, at any point, they can choose to stop being the bad guy and nothing bad will happen. Again, not something that the public typically thinks about. So from an outside perspective, it's, well, why wouldn't you help the police help you get out? And it's because you're not the one being held in a house with a gun pointed at your head. And the thing is the hostage very clearly knows this. And so to them, they have the thought process of, why would I mess up the fact that I am alive right now? Even if I sit here and do nothing for 10 more minutes, no matter how much law enforcement wants me to help them, I'm still alive for 10 more minutes. It's a lot to ask of somebody to trust the cops to handle things appropriately and get them out alive. And something that's really unfortunate is that, like I say in the intro, I'm in law enforcement. Most hostage situations, you have a very limited window to get people out alive. It's a very dire situation, not something people want to be part of. The hostage knows this. The hostage taker knows this. The cops know this. Now, I will say that this original, like when this first started becoming a thing, when hostage situations started becoming more prominent, this behavior from the hostages really confused law enforcement. Now it makes a little more sense and it's been documented, but it confused law enforcement and others when this happened because one, they weren't exposed to it, but two, they just didn't understand it. And honestly, one of the best depictions I've seen when it comes to a hostage not wanting to help themselves out of a situation is the movie Split. Now, say what you want about M. Night Shyamalan, or however you say his name. I watched that movie, and it does not do a good depiction of dissociative identity disorder, but I do think it did a good job showing the difference in how people react to being kidnapped or hostage situations, because the main character refuses to try and escape with the other two girls because at that point she would be risking her own life when she knows that just staying there and placating the individual is more likely to keep her alive. Is that always the case? No. But some people are more of the opinion like, I would rather live an extra day not getting my butt kicked by the person who kidnapped me than die 10 minutes from now because I made them mad. It's just a very difficult situation. And what it really boils down to is the risk of causing your own death for the sake of your own freedom. And in some instances, that is not a risk some people are willing to take. And with how much the trend of hostage taking has increased, this behavior will also only escalate. According to a man named Richard W. Kobetz in 1997, he wrote a book which states, these incidents have been steadily increasing since 1968 when a worldwide rash of aircraft hijackings and political kidnapping began. In New York City alone, there were 120 police actions involving hostage situations. In 1970, this figure escalated to over 300 incidents in 1973. End quote. And if Stockholm Syndrome, along with its behavior, is so prevalent, then we can't really say that it's a niche mental health condition, can we? That's not really a fair assessment. That in and of itself is contradictory. And if we really want to get into the weeds of it, we need to examine how people can seemingly change their minds and really shift entire ideologies to fit that of the captors. And that's something that I wanted to examine in my research. And if we were to look back at like the witch trials or honestly any interrogation leading to a wrongful conviction, people can and will confess to things they've never done simply to escape the stress of a situation. The psychological torment and exhaustion of a situation alone can be enough to break down a person's belief system and drive them into a protective mode of appeasement just to experience some type of relief from the situation they're in. Mirlu, in 1956, details the effectiveness of this type of torture and coercion on innocent victims accused of witchcraft. Quote, after suffering the most intense pain, the witch would not only confess to shocking sexual debaucheries with the devil, but would herself come to believe the stories she had invented and would die convinced of guilt. The whole ritual of interrogation and torture finally compelled her to yield to the fantasies of her judges and accusers. In the end, she even yearned for death. She wanted to be burned at the stake in order to exorcise the devil and expiate their sins, end quote. This type of both physical and psychological torment is defined, as I mentioned, as coercion or coercive factors, wherein a captor will coerce someone into neglecting their own belief systems for the sake of appeasement and survival. Now, some may wonder why this coercion even works, and honestly, it's a combination of things. But some postulate within the psychology community that it has to do with cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is something that I've talked about at length on this channel, but I'm going to give you guys a refresher and a reminder anyways. So, cognitive dissonance can be defined as the psychological discomfort or mental tension experienced when a person holds two or more contradictory beliefs, values, or attitudes simultaneously, or performs an action that goes against them. So, keeping cognitive dissonance in mind, let's examine like a fake hostage or Stockholm Syndrome situation. So, let's just say there's someone being interrogated for murder. They're innocent, in this situation, they 100% are innocent. This isn't like I think I'm innocent, or I say that I'm innocent, but I'm actually guilty. They are 100% innocent. So they also know that they're innocent. They're not trying to BS anybody. Yet for 10 hours straight, detectives are insisting that this person is guilty. They yell at them, they scream at them. They're not letting this person take bathroom breaks. They're barely letting this person feel like they can even breathe. And this is going to create, as one would expect, a lot of physiological discomfort that also translates into psychological discomfort. So in this case, the person being interviewed knows logically they are innocent. However, they also desperately want the situation to end. They are sleep deprived, they're hungry, they have to pee, they want to go home. And these conflicting ideas of and self-preservation instincts of, well, I'm innocent, I want them to know I'm innocent so I'm not guilty of like murder and go to prison, but also I'm really tired and I want to go home, are now opposing one another. And these sentiments will then create further discomfort through cognitive dissonance. So, to reconcile the discomfort, the person being interviewed has to do something. And what they may choose to do is confess to parts of the crime while still maintaining their innocence. For instance, admitting that they saw the murder victim at a specific time. And this may cause detectives to lay off of them for a second and kind of give the interviewee a sense of relief. And the interviewee, in turn, will feel that relief. And they may honestly believe, well, okay, I've said something that they want me to say. I'm still innocent because I didn't directly admit to the murder and I didn't confess to something I didn't do, but I told them something that they wanted to hear. And if you've been in true crime for a while and you've been exposed to multiple like wrongful conviction incidents, you'll know that this is something that happens regularly. It's almost a playbook, if you will, which is really crappy that that's how that is. Like, we can expect certain types of behaviors to be present. But again, something that could be considered Stockholm Syndrome, if we're being honest, if we're using the criteria that is very flimsy and laid out. So that's our little fake scenario to kind of help explain that. So at this point, you're probably understanding how complex Stockholm Syndrome is just as a concept, let alone as what people would consider a diagnosis. And part of the reason it's so complex and difficult is because it is something that is almost impossible to quantify, let alone study. So we're going to take this time to talk about the validity of Stockholm Syndrome, because this is important. One thing I do want to say is that when I was in school, college for my degree, I was told by a professor that anything that ends with the word syndrome in the field of psychology means that it is not validated through proper scientific channels. It's not supported empirically, and therefore it's not like a legitimate diagnosis. So not only is Stockholm Syndrome something that falls under this, but battered wife syndrome as well. So a psychologist that's worth their salt isn't going to go in court, sit up on the stand and say that these things are actual clinical diagnoses, because they're not. And so just keep that in mind for when you hear certain things where you go, oh, X, Y, and Z syndrome. Well, I've never heard of that. Chances are you haven't heard of that because it's not necessarily legitimate. So just something to keep in mind. Now, Stockholm Syndrome, like I said, is not recognized professionally or empirically. What I did neglect to mention early on, and this was intentional, is that Stockholm Syndrome was a term coined during a news broadcast by the individual psychologist or psychiatrist who didn't directly examine the bank robber victims at a clinical or research oriented level. My understanding, based on the PowerPoint I talked about, is that he didn't even interview them or speak to them. He learned about their behavior after the fact through the investigation. And it's widely known and accepted that most psychological, if not all psychological constructs, enter professional use through a very rigorous process. This process is made up of direct observation, hypothesis testing, and peer review. It's not something that happens overnight on a TV broadcast with like the snap of a finger. It takes years for something to be used in a clinical sense, let alone widely accepted, let alone validated in a court as something that you can testify to. So it's important to note that despite widespread use, the term Stockholm Syndrome has never been included in the DSM or ICD, because it's never been through that professional vetting process. It's honestly like just a colloquial term that's given a lot more weight than it probably should. We also have to acknowledge that Stockholm Syndrome is an attempt to really overanalyze normal survival behavior, which is something that we discussed prior. This type of behavior has been going on for centuries. And when we think about it logically and we think about it critically, we can understand that it's not Stockholm Syndrome and that realistically it's just a survival mechanism. But the general public doesn't really grasp that or doesn't really understand that because most people hear it and it's this word that triggers a specific perception. On top of that, the definition surrounding Stockholm Syndrome changes regularly, which made it a pain in the butt to try and find something concise enough to relate to you guys in this episode because every time I looked it up, it seemed like there was something else that was being used to define what Stockholm Syndrome is. So that is also not really lending a lot of credence to its validity within the scientific community. Like I said, it also has not been subject to peer review prior to any of the definitions changing. Now, if a definition in the DSM were to change, say for ADHD or something like that, it would have to be peer reviewed. It would go through a whole vetting process to make sure that like the definition in and of itself is encompassing of the diagnosis and that, you know, as I've mentioned in like my grooming episode, the definition surrounding pedophilia changed. And the reason that changed is because new research and new science was done surrounding it so that the definition could be refined. Well, if the definition for Stockholm Syndrome is changing every 5 minutes and there's no review process, is it really a formal type of diagnosis or any sort of formal issue at all? Then we also have to consider that Stockholm Syndrome is most often used to really define a woman's seemingly irrational behavior in a dangerous situation. And this was done because the bank robbery victims who were primarily at the center of this and were accused of having very weird and strange behavior were women. And I do think that there's a very specific reason for this that I'll talk about in a second, but it was really used in a misogynistic and demeaning way to kind of blame them for their circumstances. Now, if you look at the PowerPoint that I'm going to link in the description, you'll learn that the cops did a lot of stupid shit that really put the victims in danger and in harm's way. So I can't really blame them for wanting nothing to do with the cops. Now, going back into the women-centered aspect of this, women often resort to appeasement behavior because we learn at a very young age that that type of behavior works. Because we are taught at a very young age that at some point in life, we're not going to be able to physically overpower other boys or other men. Are there some that you could probably get away with where you could kick the crap out of them and win? Yeah. Is that going to be everybody? No. And so for us, the safest option is to appease them so that they don't beat the shit out of us and they don't try to kill us. And what's really funny is that 9 times out of 10 it works, which is great for us. But again, if women are having to rely on that type of behavior, then women are going to disproportionately be diagnosed with Stockholm Syndrome, if we were to consider that like a viable thing. So to put a very long story short, Stockholm's usage as a diagnosis is honestly kind of incredible with how flippant it is. And in my opinion, it's borderline a slang term at this point. And what we thankfully have recognized over time is that Stockholm Syndrome is really a form of appeasement or fawning, that basic bare bones survival instinct that I talked about. Because we have to remember, it's not just fight or flight. It's freeze and it's fawn. There's so many ways that people can react. You can even have a combination where you freeze at first and then you fawn, or you freeze at first and then you fight. Like, nobody's going to react to every situation the same way. Which realistically, like, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn is what all of this boils down to, except we're looking at it in the fawning sense and the appeasement sense. So no, Stockholm Syndrome isn't real, but appeasement is. And I think we finally got to the appeasement verbiage through Stockholm Syndrome. It just sucks that Stockholm Syndrome came first. But it came from a guy who was on the news, and then we all just said, yes, that makes sense. We're gullible. I can't be too mad about it. We've all said stupid stuff that people have latched onto. But I'm glad that we've kind of woken up to the fact that that's probably not accurate. And so again, we have to remember that appeasement is a very common response to the situations that hostages or kidnap victims or sex trafficking victims are placed into. Really, appeasement exists for a reason, and it's something we can subconsciously do or intentionally do because it has served a purpose for centuries. Aspects of human behavior like that, which continue to show up again and again and again, are because they have served us in some way before, right? The process of evolution. If we didn't need it, we wouldn't have it. There's a reason we don't have like 17 fingers, right? We don't need it. So we have this behavior because it serves a purpose. It exists for a reason. It is a survival instinct that not only reflects within the human race and the human species, but across other mammal species as well. Remember my example with the dog. So it's not a disease, it's not a flaw, it's not meant to be defined or medicated the way that, say, ADHD would be. And that's because ADHD, there's like a legit benefit to having medication or therapy or something for that. But yeah, Stockholm Syndrome is not real at all. But yeah, that's just the rundown of it, the history of it. Like I said, I'm going to include everything that I found pertinent for my research in the description. There's only going to be a few links. A lot of stuff that I read was redundant, and so there's no reason for me to give you 20 links when 4 will suffice. But you guys will have to let me know what you think. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it. All of your support has just been fantastic, and it means the world to me. And if you have any suggestions for future videos or future topics, please let me know. I'm super open to it. But in the meantime, please take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, and everybody stay psyched out.